It was already a challenge. We've been, bringing this to the media for as long as I can remember, from going back all the way down to about 2000. And eThekwini at that point in time realized the situation was dire, and we went through with a national conference in 2004, basically to bring local government together to say, let's deal with this problem. So, there's awareness around this for a long time, and it's not changing. It's actually has been exacerbated with the pandemic, with a severe amount of pressure being placed on local government, to find space for burials. But before and after the pandemic, this will always be a problem, and we have to find other ways to be more sustainable.
And part of the reason I imagine it becomes problematic is because it's such a multi-stakeholder decision to be made. I don't imagine government alone being the one to unilaterally decide how people should bury their loved ones. Is that what actually makes this so difficult?
Yes, it does. I mean, culture and tradition are personal, to communities. And for government to actually dip into something like that becomes very problematic. It's also very challenging to government because government is run by politicians, and it makes it very difficult for them to challenge these personal views because it will affect them directly in the vote. But be that as it may, the reality is that we have limited space, and one has to be pragmatic and be able to adapt to their changing environment. And this is what we are faced with. I see you have a shot of burials taking place. That's a huge challenge to the environment. There's a reduction of green spaces. So if we have to practice burials, then one has to find ways in which we can make it more sustainable. Greener spaces, ways to use a space, more than once, ways to, catalyze the actual burial process so that the space can be reused, and other alternatives like cremations. These things have to be seriously considered.
Right. Are those the only two options being sort of mulled over during this period? The idea of essentially reusing space that's already been used and crematoriums. Have there been no other suggestions?
Yeah.
I don't even know what they would look like, to be fair, but have there been no other suggestions being
Look,
brought forward?
for South Africans, I think, there are two legislated processes, and that's burials and cremations. And cremations, of course, is the most sustainable one in terms of space, because you need a small amount of space, and you can actually, treat bodies, a larger number of bodies in a smaller amount of space. So that makes it more sustainable. And also, I think it's environmentally more friendly. As much as you have air emissions, you're reducing the burden on the earth with decomposing bodies. It's not much different from basically having large landfill sites, and we know how that affects the earth. You're basically burying, organic matter into the soil. So you have to look at alternatives to that. But internationally, there are other methods that are coming through. We are looking at ways of, basically decomposing bodies, as rough as it may sound. But it's a method that looks at, reintroducing the body back to the earth in an organically friendly way. So those methods are being investigated in overseas, and it probably will take root in South Africa.
Yeah.
But I think for South Africans, we have to seriously consider, looking at cremations as an alternative. It's definitely a more sustainable way for us.
Right. Speak to us a bit more about the areas of particular concern, because my understanding is that different regions in the country are not affected in the same ways. From the information at my disposal, Durban having 65 cemeteries with upwards of 550,000 graves, each gravesite holding an average of 3 bodies, about 1.6 million people, and that's Durban alone. I imagine KZN is one of those areas of concern.
Yeah. Look. This is, you're looking at a history of cemeteries that span, over 100 years.
Yeah.
So, and a lot of those cemeteries are already have already reached capacity and being considered for reuse. Prior to prior to them being reused already for families. The problem is extensive. It's through all metropolitan municipalities. Where there's the centers of urbanization, the challenge is even greater. So almost all metros are facing the problem. As much as Gauteng and Joburg City may claim to have space for 1 million graves, to be able to deal with burials in the future, that's also limited, and who knows what demands will be placed on that city when it comes to housing. Some of that land may even move to housing development. So the challenge we are facing is basically to accommodate the living, and these spaces are available. We are seeing the movement of that space already in Johannesburg, where land was set aside for cemeteries and has now moved for housing development. So, it's right through metropolitan municipalities. And then, look, I don't think it's just metros that need to be concerned. I think every local authority in the country needs to be concerned, because it's all about providing sustainable services. And there's a huge burden in terms of actually providing the service. And as populations grow, it means your service needs to grow to be able to accommodate, the associated mortality rate. And right. Do we have the ability to pay for that? You have to be able to do more with less. And so whatever methodology you use has to be sustainable.
Right.
And government has to find ways to save money, right?
I do wonder whether there's anything in history that we could learn from to deal with this moment. Because if humanity has had to deal with anything consistently, is our own mortality. And the ways through which we conduct burials today is certainly not the ways through which our history books tell us burials have been conducted in the past. And that raised questions around at which point humanity, it felt like, was ready to start changing the ways through which we do things. Are those questions being asked, do you think, amongst places where the decision ought to be taken?
I think a lot of our actions are governed by business and money, basically. So if you look at, the funeral industry, it's about manufacturing and selling coffins, selling tombstones, selling a funeral service, with all of its paraphernalia that we are now seeing in South Africa with parties, etc., and food being served, etc. It's all business. And I think if you go back in time, it was more around sustainability. One had to put a body to rest. It was either, in the ground, or the body was cremated, and, people moved on. Very often the bodies might have been buried close to, it was generally on farmland because we were an agricultural society initially. But as time has moved on, everything sort of takes on a new view. It becomes more materialistic. And the more money you spend on these services, it's almost as if you're showing more love if you spend more money. The bigger the tombstone, the more you care. When in fact it's not doing that. It's taking up space. It's not carbon friendly. It's destroying the earth, and it's definitely not sustainable.
Yeah.
So our entire way of thinking has to change if we need to be able to survive, these growing environments.
Absolutely. It's often said that burials are actually not for the dead, but those who are still living. Hopefully that message will also ring true as we wrangle with these issues. Thanks very much for your time. Certainly appreciate your insight.